and welcome to the Panthers Show by Sports CLT. My name is Dylan Jackson. Today I'm joined by Jacob LaQuire. Jacob, how's it going?
I'm fired up. Even though we just had the draft, I'm already looking forward to 2027. I'm revamping all of my models and my spreadsheets, all that. So I'm fired up for next year, but really liked how this past weekend turned out for Carolina.
Yeah, we've got an entire draft class with 7 players to discuss. We've got a UDFA class. We've got an entire NFL draft to dissect. And we're just going to jump straight into it, just reviewing the 2026 Carolina Panthers draft class. Before we get started, though, you can follow Sports CLT on Twitter at Sports CLT, myself at DJ.mp4, and Jacob at Jacob LaQuire. We have a Carolina Panthers draft guide at sportsclt.com, so check that out if you have not already. Let's get into the Panthers draft class, starting with Monroe Freeling, who we reacted to it live in the moment on Thursday night. Walker Mail joined us for that pick. Jacob, this was the number one player on your Panthers specific big board, your number one Panthers target. We've had a weekend to kind of think about it. What are your thoughts on the selection, Monroe Freeling, 19th overall?
My thoughts right now are the same as they were on draft night. I think I threw up a fist pump when that pick came in, when producer Pete read it across the screen. I love this pick. I think that Monroe Freeling was the best left tackle in the draft. I think he has a chance to be a really good plus starter, especially in pass pro, which is where Carolina needs improvement. Carolina was already a good run blocking go line, but in terms of pass protection, despite the heavy amount they've invested there financially, this team's been bad in pass pro for the better part of a decade. And like losing Robert Hunt didn't help last year, but they were still a pretty bad pass protecting team. Ike Ekwonu, even when he's healthy, isn't the best in that department, even though he's an excellent run blocker. We needed to get better in pass pro, specifically at the left tackle spot. And Carolina needed to get younger and cheaper across the offensive line as well. I think taking Freeling addresses all three of those needs. I think he's a long term starter at the left tackle spot. And it wouldn't shock me if he starts even week one, considering his first round pick salary is comparable to that of Rasheed Walker, who's making swing tackle money year one. So I like Freeling's chances to start, and I'm fired up about the pick. I think he's going to bring so much athleticism, movement ability, and stability to that left side of the offensive line.
This really feels like a pick where Dan Morgan doesn't want to see the offensive line become an issue like it has been for Panthers teams in the past. Previously, it's been on the interior. It's been that left tackle spot. I remember Dennis Daly out there on an island. It was pretty rough to watch at times. Monroe Freeling, I think he is an incredibly talented left tackle. He was kind of raw when he first started getting real reps at Georgia just a year and a half ago. He's really grown throughout. I think it's been 18 total starts. You can kind of see that progression throughout his time at Georgia. Charleston native, I feel like I have to point that out every time that I talk about Monroe Freeling, but I feel like the expectation should be for Freeling to start week one, given you invested first round capital into him, given that Rasheed Walker's only on a $4 million contract. That's not even high end swing tackle money. That's good backup money, just straight up. And it's nice to have that type of insurance policy in case things with Freeling don't necessarily work out. But offensive line is also a position where you can just kind of throw guys out there if they're, young, big, have some skill to them. Monroe Freeling is a 9.99 RES guy. He has the size, he has the weight, he has the movement skills to him. I think it's going to take some time to really hone in on those skills, but I don't really see any issue in just kind of throwing him out there week one.
Especially considering Damian Lewis, the left guard, who's playing at a Pro Bowl level last year, all pro level to me, but we're probably a little bit biased there. Putting him next to a stalwart guard there with Lewis only helps Freeling, helps him get better. A little bit of insurance on inside stuff from the larger defensive lineman. You mentioned his weight. Freeling's only at 315 now, but I think he can put on a good 5 to 8 pounds in the year one NFL program because he has such a large frame, good length to him as well. And I just think that it's only up from here. And given how he played through this season and then really started to hit his stride during Georgia's playoff run, the SEC championship into the playoff run. I'm just super excited about his potential growth and trajectory, given how we've already seen it develop on the field at the college level in the SEC, where you're playing against the best opponents.
Yeah, if you look towards, let's just say the last 6 games of 2025 specifically, I don't think there was a tackle playing better college football than Monroe Freeling. And if you look at some of the mock drafts from, let's say, mid March, you'd see Monroe Freeling as high as third overall to the
Mhm.
Arizona Cardinals, right? Like he was really high up there. And that's not to say that he had a disappointing draft night falling all the way to 19, but I think that he was a player that when we were doing our live draft show, we didn't even consider the possibility of him being the pick because we thought it was going to be Thieneman.
Right. I thought Freeling was going to be the pick for Detroit at 17. And
Yeah.
when that didn't go through, that's when I really started to believe, because it was Minnesota after that, right? They take Caleb Banks, the defensive tackle. And I was just, it was a no lose situation for Carolina. Well, you could always make a bad pick, but Freeling was there, Dylan Thieneman was there, Casey Concepcion, another one of our guys, was there, Omar Cooper was there. But ultimately, Dan Morgan decides to keep the offensive line a strength, or rather make it more of a strength, I would say, fortify that spot. And I think it brings up an interesting conversation about the future of the current tackles on the Panthers roster.
Yeah, you have four tackles in that room now that could feasibly start on NFL rosters with Ike Ekwonu, with Rasheed Walker, with Taylor Moton, and obviously Monroe Freeling, who you just invested a first round pick in. I wonder what this means for Ike Ekwonu's future specifically, especially with Taylor Moton coming out this week saying that he's not in retirement mode. He's not ready to hang them up. He's got 2 years left on his contract currently. You have Rasheed Walker, who I think is 26 or 27 years old, if I'm not mistaken, 1 year contract for him. Ike Ekwonu's on the last year of his deal. It's a 5th year option, but the odds that he plays this year just went down by a lot. So I almost wonder if you get to week 6 of this year, Ike Ekwonu's kind of working his way back, and maybe they just explore the trade market, see what they can get, because starting tackles are hard to come by. If you can get something for Ike Ekwonu, if he's not in your future plans, I think it might be worth it to explore that possibility.
It's hard to see him in the near future plans, like 2027. Monroe Freeling is probably going to be this, we hope, would be the starter at that point. You mentioned Taylor Moton said he's not hanging it up anytime soon. I think Moton will play better this year too, with Robert Hunt being back. I think that was one of the we knew that Rob Hunt wasn't playing, but you're only as good as the guy next to you. And Taylor Moton was kind of dealing with some rotation at the right guard spot. So I think he'll play a lot better this year, even though Moton's getting up there in age. But that leaves Ike Ekwonu as kind of the odd man out. I don't know if they would explore moving him into guard. I think that's a possibility we talked about on draft night where, yeah, Rob Hunt's making a ton of money. Ike Ekwonu, during his own draft process, one of the things was, can he get kicked into guard at the next level? Maybe that's the best spot for him. Maybe they keep Ike around and he's the potential Rob Hunt replacement in the future. But
Yeah,
you got to explore a trade. Like if there's a left tackle needy team that can make a playoff push and they feel that's the one piece away, you're probably walking away with a second rounder at minimum for a guy
yeah.
like Aquanu, who I think above average player overall, still on his rookie scale deal. Um, that would bring a huge return if he is able to play and Carolina is able to get him out there in a trade.
Starting tackles don't hit free agency. It just doesn't
No.
happen. And when they do, they're overpaid. Look at Dan Moore just a year ago.
Mhm.
I think he had 4 years, 80 million is what it was. I think the Rob Hunt thing is one worth exploring where you could theoretically cut Rob Hunt in the 2027 offseason and save 20 million. Now, you'd almost immediately burn that money on an Ike Ekwonu extension. So that's the other part of the calculation. But if you're looking at long-term starters, Ike Ekwonu probably has more runway, assuming he returns to full health, than Rob Hunt, who I think is entering his age 30 season this year.
I wonder what Ekwanu's extension would be. At tackle, of course, it's probably going to be about 20 million. But if the team talks to him and they say, "We think your best future is at guard," I don't know if it would be 20 million, especially coming off of an injured season.
Yeah.
It would be 15 or more, I would imagine. But that's a big difference, 15 a year over 3 or 4 years compared to Rob Hunt's cap hit, which has been pushed back and back or forward and forward, and it's approaching 30 million this year as he's getting up there in age. So
The
a
other
lot to
part
consider.
is if you're Ike Ekwonu, would you request a trade at that point, knowing that at least one of the 31 other teams probably would have a place for you at offensive tackle and you would get that starting caliber tackle money?
Assuming Monroe Freeling gets off to a hot start, I think you would have to explore it or talk to your agent and have them explore it. I'm not sure Carolina would say, "All right, you can go seek a trade," but it would be a conversation to have because tackles just make more than guards, right? So it's definitely something to think about if you're a Kwanu at that point. And for Carolina, like we mentioned, if you can get a mid second round pick for a guy, like you have to absolutely do it, especially in a draft class next year, which tracks to be a lot better than this past one.
A lot better. But let's
Mhm.
let's keep to the trenches with the Panthers' second round pick. It's Lee Hunter. They traded up two spots from 51 to 49 to get Lee Hunter, 23-year-old nose tackle, two gapping nose tackle out of Texas Tech. I know you're much higher on Lee Hunter than I am. What are your thoughts?
Look at that tackles for loss column, right? TFL column. I'm salivating thinking about 31 and a half tackles for loss in the 3 years in which Lee Hunter was a starter. Putting that next to Derek Brown, who's probably the best run defending defensive lineman in the league at this point, teams aren't going to be able to run up the middle. And now that you add Jaden Phillips, Nick Scorton, who are two larger edge rushers or edge defenders, teams aren't going to be able to run at all unless they bounce it outside. So that's my first thought. Dan Morgan really wanted to improve the run defense. And out of all the nose tackles in this class, and I'm going to exclude Caleb Banks because I think he fits better as more of a three tech or somebody playing over the guard. I think Lee Hunter has the most juice out of all the nose tackles in terms of getting into the backfield. And I think that can be converted into getting after the quarterback. Now, he doesn't have a lot of juice, but none of the other nose tackles in this class did. I think Hunter's production in the backfield in the run game can be brought over into the pass game, especially when you have Derek Brown also clogging up the middle, right? It's going to be symbiotic in the fact that it's not going to be Hunter just helping Derek Brown, but the other way around, and Bobby Brown helping both of them, so on and so forth. So I'm really fired up about getting not only a potential starter and we can say assumed starter in Monroe Freeling, but I think Lee Hunter has a chance to start games early and often this year. And I would imagine he plays more than half the snaps this year at that defensive line spot.
So you think he plays? You think he's a three down lineman? I'll ask that.
Maybe not within the first 6 games, but Carolina, I think, has enough players to where none of them really need to be three down linemen other than Derek Brown. Um, and I think that's a good thing. You can have him in on rundowns. And then when it gets late in games, I think you can put him in there on pass downs as well, just by the sheer mass and force that he brings, just physics wise. It's going to make it hard for guards. Like on NASCAR packages, instead of having Bobby Brown out there, maybe you throw Derek Brown and Lee Hunter in there just to collapse the interior and have three rushers go after the QB. So early, maybe not, but I think down the line, especially this season, I think it'd be worth it to have Lee Hunter out there three downing if you need him to.
Yeah, I'm a little bit lower on him than you are. I
Mhm.
think for me, I view him with a little bit less pass rushing juice specifically than maybe what most people evaluated him with. And I think a lot of it has to do with me specifically for him just getting off the ball. He's a little bit slow off the ball. I understand the upside. And if you do project him to have a little bit more pass rushing juice, then I understand taking him in the second round with a top 50 pick. I completely get it. For me, I don't quite see it that way. I think he's more of a maybe a late day two, even early day three type of player for me. But still, I understand why they made the pick. And I'm not going to complain too much when you're adding such a physical specimen, 6'4", 318 pounds, right? This is a massive human being. And I think somebody that projects to have an immediate role on defense, even with me saying, maybe a late day two kind of player, late day two nose tackle still starts on most teams. That's a role that NFL teams covet. And I want to get your opinion on Lee Hunter versus Caden McDonald, because I think that's kind of a question that I'd like to explore, because Caden McDonald, elite run stuffing tape, not quite as much, pass rushing juice. He's a little bit younger as a player, but I think the fact that you see Caden McDonald go in the 30s, right,
Mhm.
versus Lee Hunter go, maybe a dozen picks later, I think I still prefer Lee Hunter to that value versus Caden McDonald earlier in the second round.
I would have taken Hunter where McDonald was taken. And I understand that Houston has different needs and they really need somebody just there for the run. I'm looking at my board now, and I came away at the end of the process with Lee Hunter at 29 and Caden McDonald at 36. So not a huge gap whatsoever. But Lee Hunter was the first guy on my range of early day two players, like just pure early day two players, not day one at all. And I do agree he's very slow. The first weakness or point of improvement I wrote down was just slow. And larger people are going to be slow, right? I think Caden McDonald isn't a fast person either. But what intrigues me more about Hunter than McDonald and then other people in this class like Big Citrus or Dante Corleone, who I think went undrafted, or Zane Durant, is I think Hunter's arms churn and I think his footwork, like his forward footwork getting upfield, is much better than a lot of the other guys in the class. I think he's able to fight through contact better than most of the, not most, all of the other nose tackles in this class. So I'm a little bit higher just based on the fact that I think he can go through linemen better than a lot of other players can.
I've grown on the picks since they made it. I'm still just a little bit lower on Lee Hunter than most,
Yeah,
which,
and I think that's another stylistic thing
yeah.
as well, right? It's hard to. I'm a big defensive line guy, right? You remember how high I had Walter Nolan last year? I think I had him fifth overall on my board, and it's hard to convince yourself to be convicted on a nose tackle, but I think he can be a little bit more. Doesn't have to necessarily be just the nose. I think, which is a unique thing about Carolina's defensive front. All of their guys, other than Turk Wharton, I'll say realistically should for Turk Wharton. All three of Bobby Brown, Derek Brown, and Lee Hunter are large enough to play the nose, but I think move well. Well, Bobby Brown and Derek Brown for now move well enough to play three tech, four eye, maybe even outside as your defensive end, like a five tech. I think Hunter can get there.
Hunter was also 45th on the consensus board, so I'm just
Mhm.
lower than most people. And I wasn't necessarily expecting his name to be called when Jake Delhomme went up there and announced the pick. I was expecting maybe a safety or a corner, maybe a linebacker like Anthony Hill. So I think that took me by surprise as well in the moment. But yeah, I mean he's a scheme fit, and I think NFL teams are just going to value that type of that fit, that value higher than generally looking at the consensus. So, Jacob, do you think that Lee Hunter is, I guess, the perceived Ashawn Robinson replacement?
I think right now they're going to play Turk Wharton there to start because they gave him 15 million a year in free agency. But long term, absolutely. I think Ashawn was an excellent run defender, especially in the year where Derek Brown went down with injury. I thought that the last 2 years were among the best in Robinson's career as a defensive lineman. I think within the second year, probably of Hunter's career, I think he can give you 80 to 90% of that production. Um, that Ashawn Robinson was giving you. And again, you got to remember, even Dan Morgan said this, all those guys rotate. I think they really wanted to have four comfortable guys that can rotate along the interior throughout the season. We have it written here in the notes, and I guess maybe you feel like it's a little bit of a reach. I would say it's probably fair value where Lee Hunter was taken. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of a reach, at least for me personally. I think, if you're going by consensus where he was projected to go, it's probably fair value. But I think for me personally, I would have just it was probably around early for me, is
Mhm.
what I would say. But I understand the pick. I get it with him. The upside is appealing. The fact that he does have a little bit of pass rushing juice makes it a little bit more palatable to take him with a top 50 pick. But for me, it's like, they already took him with the second round pick. They moved up to get him, and he's already
Mhm.
not my favorite prospect. But I understand it. I get it. He has the potential to be a very good fit, especially along Derek Brown, who I think helps with a lot of the weaknesses that Lee Hunter does have to his game. So let's move on to Chris Brazzell, the wide receiver from Tennessee. This is, I think, going to be the most interesting conversation that we have today because he's such a polarizing player, Chris Brazzell. The Panthers took him in the third round, 83rd overall pick. This was one of Dave Canales' favorite players in the draft. That's what Canales said after day 2. What are your thoughts on Brazzell?
Randy Moss or DJ Chark, and I mean like Jaguars DJ Chark, not Panthers DJ Chark. It's such a weird range of outcomes for Brazel because if you look at the way he played at Tulane, you could really convince yourself that this guy could be maybe a game changer at the next, like a high end receiver two for a team. And then at Tennessee, he fits into the Tennessee system where every prospect just looks lame and you hate watching them because they do the same thing over and over again. And it works for him because he's taller and faster than all the other corners that are guarding him. And so he's able to dominate there. But it's the same thing over and over. Our draft card here that was in our draft guide. I didn't do this one. I don't know who did, but
I think this one was me.
it was you, the post and go, 10 out of 10. He's the perfect go ball player. We're not talking enough about how good he tracks the ball in the air, really good tracking. Good he can be a hands catcher when he wants to. He can catch with contact if he needs to. Like look at the Georgia game. He was just frying Dalen Everett, KJ Bolden, Ellis Robinson. Dalen Everett went in this year's draft. Ellis Robinson and KJ Bolden are going to be top 50 picks next year. And Braz was just cooking them just routinely on those go balls. But it was because the quarterback at Tennessee, Joey Aguilar, couldn't get the ball to him. Braz would have to stop, get hit by one of the DBs, catch it, and then continue to run after the catch. Those are the things you love to see. What you don't love to see is how he doesn't run other routes at Tennessee. And at Tulane, he had a more of a complete route tree. But I think full body of work is the most important. But of that full body of work, what you did recently, I think really projects to what you can be immediately in the NFL. And what he did recently was just run straight down the field. So I hope there's more to his game. I hope that our collective Panther staff with a wide receiver coach, head coach, wide receiver coach, offensive coordinator, a former Pro Bowler in the NFL as a wide receiver coach, I hope they can get more out of his game because when you're watching Tennessee, this guy just looks like the guy who's going to be the sacrificial X receiver, as the folks at Reception Perception like to say.
Even if he is a sacrificial X receiver, that's a role that's valuable, I
Yeah,
think,
and a
right?
role that this team needs.
Very much needed. They needed a field stretcher, somebody that really changes the spacing of a defense and makes it easier on other receivers to get open. Receivers like Tedrow McMillan, like Jalen Coker, Xavier Leggett. He's almost like a force multiplier in that sort of way. And I think because of that, a lot of people, like to say the floor with Chris Brazzell is a little bit lower because of the route variety or lack thereof that he had at Tennessee. But I think the floor is actually pretty high because of just how good he is at stretching the field. And this is also a skill set. It's not talked about enough how good Bryce Young is at throwing go balls. It might be his best route that he throws. So I think Brazzell is a really good fit in terms of the floor that he provides, maybe being that sacrificial X receiver while also having the skills, the raw athletic ability of a high end receiver, and could potentially grow. You mentioned the development pipeline. This is a team that wants to develop players into better players. And Canales specifically stated that he wants to spend more time on player development after handing play calling duties off to Brad Idzik. I think with Chris Brazzell, The thing that scares me is that route diversity. And you hear stories all the time about former Tennessee receivers just struggling in their first offseason specifically to get up to speed because they're not asked to do regular wide receiver things at Tennessee. They're not asked to block. They're not asked to line up close to or in condensed sets, I'll say. It's just split out wide, you run fast, you run far, and you do it, 40 times a game. So
It's cook him twin offense
it
with
is
Tennessee.
genuinely not an NFL offense, like,
Mhm.
at all. It's not even a college offense, to be honest with you. It's a gimmick, and that's why you see so many of these Tennessee receivers struggle. Cedric Tillman, right? Dante Thornton. You have Jalen Hyatt. You have so many of these guys struggle at the NFL level, and it's because that system does not emphasize player development, getting guys up to NFL speed while they're there. That part is scary. I will say that if you listen to Tennessee fans and Tennessee analysts, they'll tell you that Tennessee slightly altered their system to where it's a little bit less gimmicky. It's still gimmicky, but a little bit less so. You see a little bit more route diversity from Chris Brazzell this past year versus a Dante Thornton the year before, right? And you do have the two-lane tape, which Dave Canales again cited in having more confidence in Chris Brazzell's route running ability. He's not lining up on just one side of the field. He has some slot reps back at two-lane. This is a player that I think has a really high ceiling while also having a floor of being probably a starting caliber player. This is a guy that's going to stretch the field in a way that Xavier Legette has proven that he's not really capable of, that Jalen Coker isn't quite fast enough for, neither is T-Mac McMillan. So I think that Brazzell is a solid pick at 83 overall. And you look at the consensus board, he was around pick number 50 is where people
Mhm.
thought he would go.
Yeah, I was lower compared to consensus. If you look here, I think he was 73rd on our board, and he goes 10 picks later than that. So I love the value there. I would almost call it a steal in comparison to the consensus board. I love how you brought up Bryce Young's proficiency at throwing the go ball. I think it's kind of I guess, oxymoronic because he's such a little guy that you wouldn't expect it, but his go ball touch accuracy is among the best in the league. I think when he was at his best at it was back at Alabama when he had a guy named Jameson Williams, who tall receiver, fast receiver who could get behind every DB, and Young could layer those throws at a very effective rate to the point where Young would eventually win the Heisman because of it. I think that Brazzell, I'm not comparing him to JMO. I'm not saying he has the same ceiling as JMO because JMO was close to Jerry Judy level route running coming out of college. He was just a speed freak as well. But I think that in terms of the downfield stuff, we can start to kind of wind back the clock 5 years or so and see some of that connection where Bryce Young really hasn't had that in the league. And you can see how he's not struggling to throw the go ball, but he wants to test downfield. He did it a ton this year because I think Dave Canales finally let that play happen. And you saw a lot of connections to Jalen Coker. We saw the really good one. I was impressed with Leggett in the second Falcons game down the left sideline. Perfect bucket drop to Xavier Leggett in that game. Reminded me of Russell Wilson and Lockett in that regard, former Canales players. So I think if you can add somebody who excels at that type of route, I think that's only a plus for this offense. And it's going to make Brad Idzik's life a lot easier when they're in a gotta have it down and it's like, all right, just throw the bucket up to Brazzell and let him go get it.
This was a skill set that the Panthers have needed since Dave Canales took this job. They haven't
Mhm.
had an over the top receiver, somebody that can really stretch the field. We were calling for it in last year's NFL draft. Obviously, they take Teteroa McMillan, but a lot of people wanted Matthew Golden specifically if we traded down from that 8th overall pick. So I think that this is a pick that's really going to help. I call it a force multiplier. I think it really helps the overall structure of the offense. It helps the play caller. It helps the quarterback. It's something that should really help the overall efficiency of the offense. But again, if you look at the track record of round 3 receivers in recent memory, it's not the best, but I do think that the floor is higher with Chris Brazzell just because of that simple speed and over the top ability he has.
And we've been gassing him up and stuff. You did bring up the point to where I don't think immediately that he can be the and like even within the slot, like a guy that's going to block in the run game, right?
Yeah,
I think Xavier Leggett can really take that role and run with it, like be
great
a
blocker. Yeah.
Bryson Tremaine plus kind of player, and he's going to see the field a lot on rundowns. So I don't necessarily think we could see Brazel be the quote unquote starter because most teams like to start with their run game. But I do think Brazel's going to play a significant amount of snaps down, especially down the stretch. Wouldn't surprise me if we get 65% or more in that week 10 through potential postseason window.
Let's get to the Panthers' lone fourth round pick. This is Will Lee, defensive back out of Texas A&M. This is a Dan Morgan defensive back, if I've ever seen one. An outside corner, 23 years old. He ran a 4.5 40-yard dash, but is really long, is really tall, 6'2", 32 plus inch arms. He kind of fits that mold that the Panthers really target. Dan Morgan's brought in Mike Jackson, Corey Thornton, Caleb Evans. Those are all really big corners, in addition to obviously J.C. Horn, who's a specimen at the position. So I think that the long-term outlook with a guy like Will Lee is maybe that Mike Jackson eventual replacement, who I think he's going into his 29, 30-year-old season this coming year. And I know a lot of people have been talking about potentially wanting to extend Mike Jackson, but it's really shaky to do that with those older corners.
Yeah, I'm kind of out on extending Mike Jackson. I respect his services. I think there were times this year when he was just flat out better than J.C. Horn this year.
Yeah.
Both Rams, well, J.C. didn't play the first Rams game, but the playoff game, Mike Jack was the best player on the Panthers defense. Just consistently shut down Devontae Adams. That being said, he's about to be on the wrong side of 30, and it it's real tough for me to pay a corner on the other side of 30. Even the greats start to decline once they get that 29, 30 age mark. Will Lee, however, I think you bring up a good point. He can be the eventual replacement. I think he moves well enough to be able to play slot corner early. I know Ajiro Avero also likes to rotate JC inside versus larger receivers like Kyle Pitts, so he can man the outside for a couple of reps. Will Lee, that is. I really liked how he played in 2024 as opposed to how he played this year. I thought there was a lot more on-ball production in terms of like breaking up passes, interceptions, that kind of thing. That actually tracks here if you look at the stat sheet. But I think he improved in the run game this year. One of the things I wrote with him when I watched Will Lee is I stressed how long his arms were because when he was in the air and staying in phase with receivers, it felt like he could get away with even being a step late because of his length and his vertical ability, his ability to challenge at the catch point. And you nailed it. That's a Dan Morgan. That's not even a Dan Morgan. That's a Pete Carroll corner, right? And both Morgan and Canales come from Seattle. That's where they got their roots. So I love the pick here. I don't have high expectations for Will Lee early, just because I think he does need a little bit of development. I think his one of his best strengths being a press corner doesn't really mesh with Evero's defense. Evero likes to play a lot of zone, but maybe they can incorporate some of that in. I don't know. I just like the pick. And hopefully they can work him in and not overload him like they would have to 2 years ago with a guy like Shaw Smith Wade, who was not starting day one, but once Troy Hill got cut a couple years ago, he was like immediately the starter.
Outside corner is also kind of a sneaky need for this Panthers
Yeah.
team. They didn't really have anybody besides Mike Jackson and J.C. Horn. They re-signed to Caleb Evans, who was mainly a special teams guy. He was kind of a spot starter when they absolutely needed it, but they didn't have anybody behind those two outside corners. And my thing with Will Lee and my one main concern with the Panthers taking him in the fourth round is this is primarily a man corner in
Hmm.
college. And Ezra Evero's scheme is very zone heavy. It's a lot of deep drops. I think that it's not the cleanest fit scheme wise for Will Lee. With that said, he has, I think, enough to his speed and enough length to where you could just kind of stick him outside and it'll work regardless. But it's still a little bit scary that his main selling point coming out of Texas A&M is he's really sticky in that man press coverage role, and that's just not something the Panthers do a lot of.
I agree there. One thing that helps me sleep better at night with that is that Mike Elko, the Texas A&M coach, comes from Duke. He plays a lot of man match stuff, especially on whatever side overloads. They can play zone to the boundary, and a lot of times when they would overload A&M side, that's where Will Lee had to play. And I think he is rangy enough to deal with that. If you look at his speed numbers there, they aren't the greatest, but his explosive stuff, which is how you change direction and get into covering zones really quickly, like his vertical, his broad jump, really bold green numbers there, courtesy of Tankathon, which means it's good in relation to past corners that have been drafted. I'm high on Will Lee. Hopefully, he finds himself in a role. I think, according to consensus, this was another quote unquote steal that the Panthers had. I'm pretty sure everybody was a steal outside of the seventh round pick in relation to the consensus board, but I think it's fair value. I like it. And long term, I think we will see Will Lee taking snaps away from Mike Jackson maybe next year.
I was surprised they took Will Lee because this guy, the Panthers' next pick, was still on the board. And it's Sam Hecht, the center out of Kansas State. He's kind of a smaller guy for a center, but super agile, very, very mobile. I think that there's a chance, even as a fifth round pick, Sam Hecht could compete with Luke Fortner for that starting center job. And interior offensive line is kind of a spot where you can find starters later in the draft. Tanner Bortolini, Jared Wilson, a lot of these guys that have started lately on the interior specifically have been, third, fourth, fifth round picks, even as rookies, right? Mason McCormick, another one. I think he was a fifth round rookie for the
Yeah.
Steelers a few years ago. And he looks amazing as a value as a right guard for Pittsburgh. So Sam Hecht, I think, was an incredible value. I thought the Panthers could take him honestly as soon as the second round, to be honest with you. I thought that there was a non-zero chance they'd take maybe not Sam Hecht, but a center just in general with that second round. Maybe Hecht's range started more in, early mid round 3. But I'm a huge fan of the value. I think that getting any potential starter this late in the draft is going to be a win. And the Panthers traded back 10 spots before they took Will Lee. In doing so, they moved a pick from 199 overall to 144, allowing them to select Sam Hecht. So moving back, taking Will Lee, who again was a value, and taking Sam Hecht with the pick they got from it, another value, is just, I think, frankly, amazing process by Dan Morgan.
I think this is the pick where maybe Lee Hunter we differ quite a bit, but I think this is where I differed the most from you and from consensus. I had Hecht as an early to mid day 3 guy, which is about where he went. Um, that being said, a center in this range can absolutely start in year 1. It's not as technical as tackle, obviously, and I think he has the movement ability to be an NFL center. Like you said, a little bit undersized. I'm not sure he has any elite physical traits in terms of speed, power, getting off the snap that quickly. But I think his feet are good enough. I think he's mobile enough. And generally, he's just a strong guy for his size. And I think all that stuff combined with the fact that I'm pretty sure he didn't have a sack or a penalty in this past year, if I'm not mistaken. I
That's
know both
correct.
he and the
Yeah.
guy we'll talk about next didn't have penalties at all this past season, but really proficient, former walk on. And he followed Cooper Beebe, who's on, I think he starts for the Cowboys now, as the guy at Kansas State. I'm high on him for where he was drafted. Another steal compared to consensus. And Luke Fortner, while he's been a serviceable guy, I don't think prevents you from seeing what Sam Hecht has immediately. I think one of the things that I think it was either at the combine or the owners' meetings, whatever the most recent presser was before the draft, Dave Canales said Luke Fortner is going to have a chance to compete for the starting spot. Well, they didn't have any centers on the roster other than Fortner when he said that. So I think drafting a center was always in mind. And I think that having Sam Hecht or whoever they drafted competing with Fortner was always in mind. Wouldn't surprise me if we see Hecht beat out Fortner day 1 or let's say week 6 down the line. but I think we're going to see a lot of Hecht and Freeling on the field at the same time this season.
Yeah, and you mentioned Cooper Beebe. I want to bring up a stat that I researched before this. I wanted to get instances of two rookies starting together for the majority of an NFL season. And it's happened 6 times since 2022. Last year, obviously, Will Campbell and Jared Wilson, they were the left side of the Patriots offensive line. I think the Patriots are moving Jared Wilson to center this year, if I'm not mistaken. So maybe a little bit better of a role for
Uh,
him.
do we know where Lomu's going to play for the Patriots?
I assume that he's the long-term Morgan Moses replacement.
Okay, because I didn't know if they were thinking of moving Campbell inside or what. He was good in the
Probably
regular season, right?
should.
But I think in the playoffs, you have to think about that a little bit.
You could really tell he was getting exposed for his lack of length in the
Mhm.
playoffs. It was not a fun watch. Going back to 2024, it happened 3 times. Maybe not as pretty of an example, but Delmar Glaze and Jackson Powers Johnson both played 14 games for the Las Vegas Raiders. That was a pretty bad offensive line. But you look at the Steelers, I mentioned Mason McCormick. Him and Zach Frazier started 13 games for the Steelers together in 2024. And I think the most comparable example of two rookie offensive linemen starting together recently is Tyler Guyton, who was the Cowboys' first round pick in 2024, and Cooper Beebe, who was a mid round pick for the Cowboys that same year. They started 11 games together. So there's a lot of good examples. There's some not so good examples. Another one in 2022, Jamari Sawyer and Zion Johnson starting for the Chargers for a good majority of their season. So I think it's good to at least have the optionality of it, to have the depth to at least consider the possibility of starting both Hecht and Monroe Freeling from week one. Maybe not week one, but maybe later down in the season, you see a little bit more consistency from Freeling. You add a guy like Sam Hecht to the starting lineup. I think that it's a very strong possibility we get another 10 plus games from a rookie offensive line combination.
I like the Cooper Beebe one, and Tyler Guyton. Cooper Beebe obviously preceded Hecht there at Kansas State, and I hope that Monroe Freeling has a better rookie season than Guyton. Up and down for Guyton there in his rookie year, but thinking about the Cowboys, they've really remade that O line recently, right? Those two, Tyler Smith and Tyler Booker. It's the Tyler offensive line there in Dallas. They just need I think, a right tackle, Tyler, and they would have 4 out of 5. But that's the way to go. And I'm glad that the Panthers really started to emphasize that Freeling and Hecht were Dan Morgan's first two offensive line draft picks in 3 years. So good
Yeah.
to see that level of development. And I think with that, the Panthers have drafted every position outside of quarterback now, and I guess guard now, if you want to consider Hecht just a center. But really diversified draft approach from Morgan. But love that they honed it in on the offensive line this year.
Let's get to Zakee Wheatley. The Panthers traded up 7 spots in the 5th round to pick 151 to select Zakee Wheatley. He's a versatile piece. What are your thoughts on Wheatley in the 5th round?
I like it. Another guy with no penalties, right? Which I think is huge for O line and defensive backs, probably the two most prone penalty positions. Not a ton of on ball production. You only see 6 interceptions across 4 years as a high contributor there at Penn State. But when he does produce, they're really splash plays. I've seen the interception, I think it was against Iowa, where he one hands the deflection probably 100 times on my timeline since the Panthers drafted Wheatley. I think he's a larger player that can cover a pretty significant range. And while he's not the fastest, I think his play recognition makes up for that and gets him to where he needs to be um, to make up for his speed or lack thereof, I should say. The Panthers needed another back end player after Caleb Downs and Dylan Thieneman. It was really, and I guess Emmanuel McNeil Warren, it was really take your pick. And I'm glad that the team addressed probably more pressing needs throughout the process, like getting Brazel in round 3, Will Lee for corner depth, and Sam Hecht before they circle back to Zakee Wheatley at safety.
Yeah, this was another guy that was really high on consensus boards. I think he was a top 100 player on the
Mhm.
consensus board, if I'm not mistaken. I think 88th overall. He I'm not sure if he'll start because he's a different kind of safety than I think most people were expecting the Panthers to take. I think most people were expecting more of a over the top guy, good coverage player. I think we're both higher on Nick Scott than what most people are. To me, this is almost more depth for Trayvon Merrick with the possibility of playing a little bit of over the top, like center fielding kind of safety. He's a versatile piece, 4'6", 40. I think that he's going to be kind of a chess piece that's really good on special teams, particularly in year one. I'm excited to see how they use him, but I think he's going to be more of a fun, interesting, almost like a think of how Damani Richardson was deployed in
Mhm.
2024 and then make Damani Richardson like twice as good. I think that's what Wheatley will be.
I think that's a really good point to where he's not necessarily going to be the immediate deep third cover safety. I really think the team is trying to convert Lathan Ransom into that role. When you would see him on the field early, and I'm thinking week 3, that Falcons game, in relief as the Panthers skunked the Falcons in that one, he was playing closer to the line. But as the season went on, the team moved him further and further back. He wasn't a true like Ed Reed, I'm just going to sit back there and hawk everything down safety. But by the end of the year, he was getting 12 to 15 yards at depth at the start of the snap. I think about the interception against the Buccaneers to end that game. He's playing as the deep guy on that one. He reads Baker, the miscommunication comes up and makes the interception. It wasn't necessarily his game at Ohio State, but I think the team really is trying to push Ransom into that role. So it would make sense that a versatile player like Weekly doesn't necessarily need to be a deep third guy and can be relief for Merrick, for Nick Scott whenever they need it, or when they bring Merrick down as a like the big nickel linebacker, Wheatley, Ransom, or Scott can replace one of those two. All of them can play in the back end there, but I wouldn't be quick to call him the starting deep safety or somebody who's going to play significant snaps as the high guy on the cover 2 set.
Yeah, no, I don't think he'll start. I think he might, if you see an injury to a guy like Trevon Merrick, he might get some spot starts in there, but I
Mhm.
don't think we should expect anything more from Wheatley in year one specifically. Let's
Yeah,
get to
still like him
these.
though.
I still like him. Good
Yeah.
value. Let's get to the seventh round pick. Jackson Kuwach, the linebacker out of Miami of Ohio. He is a player that had a kind of amazing athletic profile. He was a Shrine
Mhm.
Bowl player. I don't think he was invited to the combine. You can correct me if I'm wrong about that. But what are your thoughts on Jackson Kuwach? I didn't even grade this pick in the article that I wrote, grading all of the Panthers draft picks, just because I'd never seen him play before, not even heard his name, to be honest with you.
It's hard to grade seventh rounders. A lot of times, seventh round picks are players that the scouts have honed in on, like they're down on the bottom of the team specific boards. Maybe guys that aren't necessarily in the spotlight. And I think Kuwach fits that to a T. He has the fastest 10-yard split ever in the 40-yard dash for a linebacker. He is 100th percentile in mock draftables database. They're a good resource for athletic testing for NFL draft prospects. And athletic freak in the 7th round, that's all you got to convince me on, right? This past season, he's been in college for 5 seasons. This past season was his first as a starter. And this year, he was kind of the budget version of Anthony Hill Jr. He was all over the place, sacks, disruption on the ball. He had over 100 tackles, I believe, 5 sacks this season. And I think he's not despite him being like a big guy, I think he's 6'4". I don't think he's necessarily the strongest from what I've seen, but you can make up with that with speed and explosive ability. And it's clear that he has that. I think Kuwach is going to be, I wouldn't expect him to start any games unless there's major injury, but I think he can be a core 4 teamer with his tracking ability in terms of pursuit of the ball carrier. I think he has the speed to get down there on both on like punt returns as a gunner and on kickoff returns as someone who can bring down the returner. So if you're getting a core 4 teamer in the 7th round, you really can't complain about that. And the linebacker spot needed depth, right? Outside of Devin Lloyd and Trevin Wallace, we're down to Claude Cherilus again and Bam Martin Scott, who believe was an undrafted free agent last year from South Carolina.
Last time Dan Morgan drafted a round seven linebacker, he traded him for Mike Jackson. So
Well, that round seven
it worked
linebacker
out
was
last time.
I think he
Not
was like
necessarily.
5'10".
Yeah,
Um, not the traits guy that Koo watches.
Michael Barrett.
Michael
Yeah,
Barrett. Mhm.
yeah. Let's talk about some UDFA's. There were a few that kind of caught our eye. Devontae Smith with the exact same spelling and capitalization as the Eagles receiver. This one is a defensive back from Notre Dame. Isaiah Smith, an edge from SMU. Any major thoughts on either of those two guys before we get to the big one?
Devontae Smith, former Alabama player, potential former Heisman winner, depending on who you ask. Most recently at Notre Dame. I think the Panthers still need a versatile back end piece, whether it's one of your safety spots, whether or like the slot corner spot. So I could see him making being on the practice squad and being like a rotation guy there. Isaiah Smith, probably the guy I'm highest on outside of the guy we'll talk about in a second. A good edge rusher, 18 tackles for loss this year, which led the ACC, 8.5 sacks. Originally at Florida, but played at SMU the last 4 years. He dominated against Clemson and Boston College. I had to go back and watch the Clemson game. He was giving Blake Miller and Tristan Lee work in that game. So even though I'm pretty cool with how the edge rusher room is, or at least the top four guys in that rotation, I think you could always use another pass rusher. So I would think he makes it onto the practice squad as well. But the main course here in the UDFA group has to be Haynes King, the quarterback from Georgia Tech, I believe. Um, yeah, Georgia Tech, I think. And
Georgia Tech.
yeah,
We have it written down as
the
Wake
notes
Forest,
threw
I
me
think.
off a little bit. I just wanted to make sure, but I was like, he played in that 8 overtime game against Georgia, right? And he did really good. It's an interesting fit because Haynes King is closer to Taysom Hill than he is to Bryce Young in terms of
Yeah.
skill set. But I think that they really value athleticism at the backup spot or the QB3 spot, considering they sent Andy Dalton away for Kenny Pickett, who, even at age 40 or whatever Andy Dalton is, better arm than Kenny Pickett right now. Better hands as well, probably. But Haynes King, completely different skill set, big guy, like 6'3" plus, built guy, because at Georgia Tech, they use you as the 11th player is the QB in the run game. So they run the ball a lot there. It's an interesting fit. And he was somebody who had a 30 visit with Carolina. So I always thought we might see a quarterback picked in the seventh, or we had a sixth round pick initially. Thought there could be a quarterback pick there, but they really prioritized King in undrafted free agency. You had the contract details, and I think you said that it related to essentially a sixth round draft pick contract for Haynes King.
That is correct. Yeah, they gave him $250,000 guaranteed, which
Mhm.
is equivalent to, it's like the range is basically, it could be anything from an early sixth round pick to a mid seventh round pick. So cut the difference. It's about a sixth round pick in terms of money that they spent on
So,
Haynes
so
King.
he's making the roster, is
He
what I think.
They gave the exact same amount of guaranteed money to Jalen Coker, if that tells you anything. I think, if you kind of read the tea leaves, A, the 30 visit, B, Joe Person had the Panthers selecting Haynes King in his final mock draft. I think the guaranteed money is one thing. I think that there's a real shot that Haynes King has the inside track to making the roster as the team's QB3. He's an interesting piece. I almost assume with that level of contract guaranteed, if there was like a handshake agreement, like, hey, I'll tell teams not to draft me if you give me this contract, and you could spend your seventh round pick however you want. That's how things happen in the seventh round. A lot of times, teams don't listen most of the time, but if you're getting $250,000 guaranteed as a UDFA, you have a real shot to make the roster.
Getting a long-term developmental backup, he won't be the backup immediately, but that's been a talking point ever since the season ended for Carolina. They wanted the QB room to be younger, no pun intended with Bryce Young, but the backup was Andy Dalton. I don't know if he's 40 yet, but he's getting really close to it. And they haven't had another QB in there outside of like during the summer they had the tennis Hendon Hooker they had, but he was cut before the season started. It's only been Young and Dalton, so it's clear that they've wanted more youthful backups since then. And even though they signed Will Greer maybe the day of the draft or a day before the draft, that was probably an insurance policy in case they couldn't get one of these deals
I
worked
mean,
out.
you saw where these quarterbacks were going.
Yeah.
Like
Well, yeah,
Carson
like
Beck went, I think,
65th.
65.
Yeah, Aller went in the 3rd round, is it maybe the 4th round? Um, I'm happy that it was Haynes King instead of somebody like Baron Morton, or I think Morton was drafted,
He
or Diego
was.
Pavia, who's now with the Ravens at their mini camp. I think King is the best out of all those guys, and I think those were the only quarterbacks Carolina had a 30 with. They had one with the Minnesota Moorhead guy as well, who ended up on the Falcons UDFA roster. So potential storyline there. But I really think King has a shot at making the roster. It's clear that Canales wants to develop a backup behind Bryce Young. And I'm not going to say that they're going to have him in there for Taysom Hill stuff, but the lack of movement at tight end might lend itself to, all right, Haynes King, you might be getting the QB sneak or something like that.
Could be. Could be. There
Mhm,
might be a package or two for him. Certainly more mobile than a guy like Kenny Pickett, who's the backup
mhm,
right now. I want to talk about, let's shift gears just a little bit. We've talked a lot about the Panthers draft. Before we get out of here, we have one more topic jotted down that I think we both really wanted to talk about. And it's just that the two draft classes that we found the most confounding, I think it's two of the more unique team draft classes that we've had over the last 5 years. And we'll start with the 49ers. What are your thoughts on what the 49ers did? Before you get into it, I'm just going to read their
mhm.
day two picks specifically. With the 33rd pick, they took Dejon Stribling, who I think the Panthers had a 30 visit with,
They had a
and he
Zoom
was
with them.
they did Zoom.
Mhm.
So he was projected late day two, like maybe late third round, early fourth round. 49ers took him with the first pick of the second round. They took Romello Height with an early third round pick, and Kalen Black, a running back out of Indiana, with their late third round pick. Romello Height, an edge rusher out of Texas Tech.
My initial thought was, I I'm glad we didn't do a day 2 stream because that would have been a longer stream following the draft, but I wish we would have recorded for the first 10 minutes to
Yeah,
see the reactions of the Dejon Stribling pick. It He was close to 100th on the draft board. He had a little bit of a late rise, in the process, but ultimately around consensus, he was close to 100, close to 80. They take him above. Let's think of the receivers there. Jeremy Bernard was there.
Denzel
Uh,
Boston.
Denzel Boston went 3 or 4 picks after to Cleveland, division rival. Antonio Williams went later. Chris Brazel, Chris Bell both went later. Ted Hurst, also on day 3. That's just such a weird one. Romello Height is designated pass rusher only at this point. He played opposite of David Bailey at Texas Tech. And then Kalen Black, the running back from Indiana, I'm pretty sure it wasn't a combine invite,
He was not.
and he was the 90th pick. I think that's the highest a non-combine player has ever been taken, or at least on the
Crazy.
broadcast they alluded to within the past 15 to 20 years. Um, that's such a weird day 2. They didn't have a first. They did have a first round pick, but they traded back twice, I think, to move back to traded back twice. Initially with whoever picked 30th, and then again to the Jets because the Jets wanted Omar Cooper. So 2 trade backs to get a receiver that the 49ers made sure to know that he played quarterback in 7th grade. They stressed that in their presser. And it's just interesting. Grant Cohn, who is a beat writer for San Francisco, I think covered their draft class pretty well with his reaction episodes throughout the night. It's it's top 2 worst, and it is second worst for me because we'll talk about the worst one later, but it's just incredibly disheartening that every year the past 4 years, the 49ers do this, don't get any contributors, and Kyle Shanahan is turning his hair gray, working magic with a roster devoid of talent. So,
Yeah, it's reach after reach with this
mhm.
draft class. It's like it's guys that you realistically should be taking at least one round later, if not more than that. I I'm begging them to take an offensive lineman. I've been begging for years and years, and it just hasn't happened. The first offensive lineman that they took in this class was Carver Willis, a offensive tackle who's going to move to guard, and they took him with a very late fourth round pick. But it was funny to see Grant Cohn in particular, anytime the 49ers made a pick or a trade, I'd refresh Twitter and I would see him walking through the 49ers tunnels right before, I'm assuming, the 49ers announced the pick to their press. So great beat reporter. Definitely pressed John Lynch after the draft about like why they stray so far from consensus. I think he even used he basically told him that, these guys aren't working out. Why do you keep reaching? And
Mhm.
John Lynch essentially told them that they have consensus in the building, which is good for them. It hasn't worked, and I feel a little bit bad that they keep coming away with these types of classes for their fans. It's been a while since they've had a good one.
Over the last, I'm trying to think, what year was Trey Lance? 21.
Think so, yeah, 2021.
So Brock Purdy, Mr. Irrelevant, and then Talanoa Hufanga, I think, were there only two good players from like since then. Six
Yeah.
drafts, which is crazy to think about. Grant Cohen, one of the best in the game. Just very, very funny to see him. He must have a suite there in the stadium where he can just walk around the concourse all the time. The last thing I'll say about the 49ers is they originally had the 27th pick. Do you know who went pick 28?
I'm assuming it's Keelan Rutledge, I think is who it was,
It,
right?
I think Rutledge went before because I think
Okay.
they traded up. The pick after that was Caleb Lomu because
Okay.
the
Yeah. That would
Patriots
have
traded
been,
up.
I
You know
think
what
that was
would have
somebody
been
that I'd
nice?
mocked.
Yeah, if they could get a long term Trent Williams replacement, who we talked about, Rob Hunt and Taylor Moton being on the other side of 30. Trent Williams is almost 40, so getting
Yeah.
a replacement for him would have been nice in the first round. But they traded out twice to cultivate this draft class, which it was either the worst or the second worst in terms of
Second worst.
reaches on
Second worst.
the consensus board. Let's talk about the worst now that we're here. If you thought those names were interesting, just wait till you hear what Dylan's about to say about the Jacksonville Jaguars class.
Okay, so I have the Jags class. Obviously, I don't have a first round pick due to the Travis Hunter trade. I don't
Mhm.
even we don't even have to talk about that because it's an incomplete trade. We're still waiting to
Right.
see on what Hunter can be.
And honestly,
Even
I'm cool with it. Like
yeah, yeah,
you take the potential on Hunter, even if the receiver doesn't work out, all pro corner ceiling. So you know what? I'm
yeah.
absolutely cool with that.
Independent of that trade, this class is still horrendous. They had a second round pick and 3 third round picks. I think they ended up with 10 total draft picks.
Hmm.
So I'm going to read the names, their position, their school, everything. Their first pick. This was, I think, maybe the first really wow pick of the draft. It was Nate Borkacher, the tight end out of Texas A&M. They come back mid third round and take Albert Regis, a defensive tackle, run stuffing defensive tackle outside of Texas A&M again. They take, I think, a really good value, which the 49ers didn't have at all, in Emmanuel Pregnon, the guard out of Oregon. You also have Jalen Husky, the defensive back out of Maryland. That was the last pick in the third round. And then you have just a bunch of dudes that probably aren't draftable on day 3. Tanner Korzal, Josh Cameron, CJ Williams, Zach Dufree, and Parker Hughes were among the names taken on day 3. A lot of those players just weren't projected to be drafted. The so the Nate Borkacher pick, the justification behind taking a player like that with a mid to late second round pick, he was, I think, 160th on the consensus big board, if I'm not mistaken. So 3 rounds early is, blocking tight ends are increasing in value in the NFL, and he's one of the few guys that can line up in line and potentially run routes. I don't know
Potential.
that that's worth a second round pick.
Yeah, the acting word there is potentially
Yeah.
run routes. On the broadcast, they made sure to stress, and I feel bad that they showed this for Borkacher's sake. They made sure to stress, they do the bullet points. This season, career high 198 receiving yards on 19 receptions, and I think he had a touchdown as well. So just over 10 yards of reception this year at Texas A&M. Look, blocking tight ends are becoming important. The more we see 12 and 13 personnel be viable, You need a true blocker. I'll say the best team at it, the LA Rams. They have tight ends, but their receivers can also block. So I think that's a force multiplier that teams really aren't investing in, is getting a Bryson Tremaine, if you will, or maybe long term Xavier Lee Get, who can block and also run routes. I think that's way more valuable than a blocking tight end or somebody like Chris Manhertz, who played that role for close to a decade in the NFL. That was definitely the earliest, largest reach, I would say, was Borkature. And then they followed it up with about uh, 7 out of 9 reaches, I think is what it was. Emmanuel Pregnan, I think, is good value. The guard from Oregon, he could be a plug and play starter. I don't know the interior O line situation for the Jags, but they weren't world beaters last year. Their offensive line wasn't. Trevor Lawrence was he's having to move quite a bit down the stretch. And then the other pick that I was cool with, that I actually liked, was Josh Cameron, the receiver out of Baylor. I liked both him and Michael Trigg, the Baylor tight end. I thought they did more with less there with Sawyer Robertson, the quarterback, and the scheme that Baylor runs. So I was pretty cool with that one. Um, but that's about it as far as the picks I was cool with theirs. It felt like every single time there was a reach, it was either the 49ers or the Jaguars. And after the draft, James Gladstone, their general manager, said, I think he said they hit 10 out of their 11 draft targets, like specific names. And they were consensus within the building. They were happy with that class. So I do hope it works out for them. If you look at their combined 2 drafts, and obviously we can't grade this draft yet. These players have yet to take a snap. We don't know if half these players will make the team because the Jags were a good team, right? But if you look to last year's draft, you didn't get a ton out of Travis Hunter, and some of that was injury, some of it was him being overworked. The rest of that draft class, you got nothing outside of Bashal Tutin, who
Yeah.
played sparingly in a backup role. He might be the starter now because the only running back they brought in free agency was Chris Rodriguez, who also he played for Liam Cohen at Kentucky in college, so some familiarity there. But their running back room, one of the needs, in my opinion, for this team is Bashal Tutin, LaQuint Allen, who was a 7th rounder, and now Chris Rodriguez. If you look at this draft board or this draft they have here, no running backs either. So it was an interesting one for sure. And I don't think they particularly addressed the team needs super well.
ESPN analytics, I think it's Seth Walder, I think is his name. He said after the Jalen Husky pick, who the Jaguars took with the 100th overall pick, so very late 3rd rounder, the last pick on day 2, Seth Walder said that Jalen Husky, just in general, his odds to get drafted were 18%. That's just not good
And
process, I don't think.
and
And I
then there
feel
were
like
150 more picks after him.
yeah, yeah, and this kind of reeks to me of a team that's a little bit too confident and thinks they're just kind of outsmarting the rest of the field, where they're just passing on a lot of the talent that's on the board that, you know, a lot of people are very, very high on. It would be one thing if they were modest reaches, right? It would be one thing
Yeah,
if it's
20
around
point
early,
reaches.
right?
Yeah, around early.
But it's guys that are borderline draftable in a lot of cases, right? If Nate Borkature wasn't drafted, nobody would talk about it. And they took him in the 2nd round. That's crazy. I don't know. I'm
Uh,
just the more time that goes on with Gladstone specifically, the more I kind of think I'm not sure he's got it.
Well, he comes from the Rams front office, and the Rams famously are very nonchalant, at least public facing, nonchalant throughout the process. They don't go to the combine, they don't host 30 visits. But the difference is, I'm very confident in Les Snead because not only does he trade away the 1st round pick for stars, when he does that, his 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th rounders turn into contributors and star players in some cases for his roster, right? Kyron Williams, 3rd rounder, Puka Nakua, 5th rounder. You can go down the board. A lot of their O linemen were day 3 picks. Their left tackle, Alaric Jackson, 7th rounder, I believe, out of USC because of I think some medical stuff. But they have a ton of contributors on their team from late round picks. I don't think we're going to see a ton of that this year from Jacksonville. We didn't see it last year, really, because Bashal Tutin was a 4th rounder. He was really the only contributor. And it's giving the 49ers a lot. And I feel very bad for Kyle Shanahan because I think he makes magic out of basically nothing when the EMF substation hits the 49ers by week 8 every year and reduces their roster. That was scientifically proven wrong, by the way. For legal reasons, that's a joke. I think the Jags are gonna remind me of that because I think Liam Cohen has really transformed what the Jags can be given the limitation of their roster. I just hope it's not gonna turn into, all right, Liam, here's the guys we added. Now you got to go make something work with it.
Man, those two draft classes just stick out so
Mhm.
sorely. It's a shame. I wish I could get behind the Jags process a little bit more. I can't do it.
And I
Um,
really like Houston's outside of the Rutledge early trade up, which is kind of a reach, but they needed a guard. I really like them doubling back and getting Caden McDonald. And if Stroud, excuse me, shows a modicum of what he was his rookie year, they should be the favorite to win the division with the talent that they have. So I think the Jags' lead on the division isn't as strong as maybe the records perceived last year. So they
they
needed to do some work.
they had a lot of positive variance on their
Mhm.
side last year with a lot of the turnover stuff going their
Devin Lloyd
way.
is not there anymore.
Devin Lloyd's not there anymore. I just they didn't do anything in free agency. They had, in my opinion, the worst draft class of any team. I'm really struggling to see how they're not at least marginally worse. They won 13 games last year. I
Mhm.
wouldn't be surprised if they had a losing record in 2026.
I'm just looking at their schedule really quick.
They have a
That
first place schedule, right?
they do, and they pulled the Patriots, which Patriots are their roster. I think is worse than their record, but Drake May is an MVP caliber quarterback. They pulled so they're playing the AFC North, so that means they would have also pulled the who would be the Broncos is their other first place team, and the Bears is their um, NFC team. So pretty similar to the Panthers schedule, honestly. A lot of first round place teams that are looking to go to the Super Bowl. So it doesn't inspire a ton of confidence. And yeah, it's just tough to see. I like the Jaguars. They came into the same league or the same they came into the league at the same time as the Panthers, so it's always been a cool mirror. Um, so I don't like to see them struggle. So hopefully they can outperform our bad views on this draft class.
With that, we're going to get out of here. We've talked all of the Panthers draft picks. We've talked some draft day stuff as well. You can find Jacob at Jacob LeQuire on Twitter. You can find myself at dj.mp4. You can find SportsCLT at SportsCLT, of course. Thank you for listening to the Panthers show. Be sure to like, subscribe, whatever on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Substack. I just released the Charlotte Hornets NBA draft guide, so go check that out if you have not already. And yeah, peace.